For over 60 years, one man presided over the British comedy landscape, defying fashion and trends to become one of Britain's most beloved and enduring writer-performers. Barry Cryer was a comedian, actor, raconteur, presenter, and one of the finest comedy writers Britain has ever produced. I'm Jack Dee, and for over a decade I had the privilege to work alongside Barry on the Radio 4 juggernaut I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue. In doing this, I got a real insight into the man behind the sharp one-liners and parrot jokes. But I wasn't the only one. From 2010 to 2017, Josh Barry interviewed this comedy legend 4 times, which culminated in the 2017 Christmas special of Beyond the Title. Now, to mark the 5th anniversary of his death, with the help of a sprinkling of colleagues and friends, we celebrate one of the most important figures in post-war comedy, the polymath that was Mr. Barry Cryer.
There's a man driving down a country lane when he runs over a cockerel. He knocks at the nearby farmhouse door, and the farmer's wife answers. "I appear to have killed your cockerel," he says, "and I'd like to replace it." The woman replies, "Well, please yourself, the hen's around the back." Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Beyond the Title, which aims to kickstart what promises to be a fantastic series celebrating the life and legacy of a true comedy legend, powerhouse, and comedy encyclopedia. Obviously, I'm not Josh Barry, and by now you will probably have realised that this is another one of those personal perspectives episodes saluting an important figure in the industry. I'm the writer and actor Bob Cryer, which might give you a bit of a clue about the identity of the subject we're celebrating. Yes, over the next few weeks, we'll be tearing up the podcast schedule and celebrating one of Josh's heroes, the much-missed comedy legend Barry Cryer, or Dad as I knew him. Therefore, from now on, when I say I'm referring to Josh. If you listen to either the TV Centre episode with Ian Lee or the Bob Monkhouse episode with the great Harriet Thorpe, you'll know the format. But if you don't, you'll hopefully understand as we go along. For as long as I can remember, I've loved comedians and light entertainment. As a kid, I'd spend hours upon hours sitting in my parents' living room in front of the television, and for some reason, good old-fashioned light entertainment spoke to me in a way that very few shows did. If it had a shiny floor, twinkling lights, and big stars, I was in. For the people who knew Baz, you might be smiling at this point, because despite his comedy pedigree, there was forever a slightly rustic feel to his character. He didn't care for the glitz and glamour of the spotlight, and instead was more at home in an underground club than on a shiny TV floor. Instead, the name Barry Cryer stuck in my head from a very young age as a result of his various guest spots on a handful of shows, including The Generation Game. In hindsight, it seems strange that I discovered him in this way, when we would later enjoy many cherished hours discussing his achievements as a writer. You could say at this point, I merely knew Barry as a turn. This was all about to change on Friday the 16th of June 1999, when BBC One devoted a whole evening to celebrating the 2 Ronnies. It shows you how times have changed. You could never imagine BBC One devoting a whole evening's worth of valuable airtime to anything nowadays. Even Children in Need and Comic Relief have been drastically reduced to merely a few hours. So this shows you how special the 2 Ronnies were, and a celebratory evening saluting their legacy was richly deserved. This consisted of 2 programmes broken up with Corbett and Barker reunited behind the famous news desk, delivering the iconic traditional jokes shaped in the style of news items, a device ironically created by Barry himself. The 2 Ronnies night continued after the news with a reunion of cast and crew alongside the indefatigable Ronnies, Corbett and Barker. To preside over a feast of comedy, memories and nostalgia, the show required a host who had a vested interest. At this point, I had no idea that Barry Cryer was one of the most accomplished and respected comedy writers Britain had ever produced. But also, as he presented this celebration, I also realised that I was indeed witnessing a master at work. Unlike his contemporaries, like Tarby, Brucey, or Ronnie Corbett, Barry wasn't a member of the golf club, nor was he seen at showbiz parties or functions. Being a member of the Grand Order of Water Rats brought him this sense of community and helped raise funds for charity, but it was never something that he craved. He was greatly loved by his industry and had a diverse range of friends within entertainment, whom he would regularly socialise with. However, work was always work, and he never needed to be associated with a particular group to make himself part of the show business establishment, because being Barry Cryer was all he needed. Instead, comedy was his sport, and something that he had a deep love for. He loved Soho back in the day, with all its earthy appeal and vibrant hotspots, which he regularly frequented during the 60s. It seems pertinent here to say that even up to the pandemic, Barry could regularly be seen at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club, where he would perform songs obviously with a sprinkling of quintessential Barry Cryer one-liners. It was very clear to all who met him that wherever there was a stage, he would fill it with laughter. I was indeed lucky enough to witness this on a few occasions, and always found it extraordinary how he was never stuck for a line, even when interacting with the public, which some entertainers find difficult. He loved the art of conversation, as this was where he could flex his skills as a raconteur. In many ways, it seems absolutely absurd why he was omitted from the chat show circuit, because I believe that he would really have thrived on shows like Wogan or Parkinson. However, astonishingly, Barry appeared on Wogan just once in 1991, and never on Parkinson, although he did once tell me about a story when the great Kenny Everett was a guest on the show as his drag alter ego, Cupid. Barry was accompanying him to the show as his writer, and when Parky asked for her full name to use in the introduction, Barry took great delight in replying with the word stunt. Even telling the story more than half a century later, you could see the twinkle in his eye as realization that he successfully rocked the establishment. This was just one of the beautiful things about Baz. No matter how beloved or legendary he became, there was forever a rebellious, almost anarchic spirit in him that just wanted to laugh at the pompous absurdities of the world, and we laughed along with him, as producer Dirk Maggs remembers.
And over the years, Barry became the friend to me that he was to so many other people in the business. He was encouraging, he was full of sage advice, he was a hoot to be with.
This instinctive comedy palette made him into one of the most beloved performers on the circuit. The comedian's comedian is a cliched term, but whenever I meet comedians either face-to-face or electronically, as soon as I tell them I knew Barry, they immediately relax, as in, well, if Baz knew him, then he can't be that bad. This must have been a common notion for many performers throughout the years, who looked at him as a yardstick for quality in comedy, which reminds me of a story that the great Geoffrey Holland once told me. In 2001, Jeff teamed up with Andrew Seacombe and John Glover for Goon Again, a tribute show commemorating 50 years of The Goon Show. Unfortunately, Spike Milligan and Harry Seacombe were too unwell to attend, but as Jeff explains, Barry was on hand to deliver his seal of approval.
And Barry Cryer, afterwards, in the bar, in the pub, came up to me and he said, just 2 words. He looked me straight in the eye and he said, spot on. So I thought, well, that was praise indeed from a master of comedy himself. Yeah.
Spot on indeed. Yet Jeff wasn't the only performer to get the Barry Cryer nod. In fact, Barry took much pleasure in complimenting and championing the talents of fellow performers. In fact, for a certain generation of comedians, receiving a phone call from Barry Cryer on your birthday could compare to getting a knighthood. Phone calls were a favourite pastime for Barry, as Michael Grade remembers.
His jokes were always, you always knew his joke was going to be fresh and very, 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 very funny. He was just miraculously funny. He just loved making people laugh. That was why he got up in the morning.
I first met Barry at the Tivoli Theatre in Wimborne in the spring of 2010, when he was performing one of his That Reminds Me tours, which I'd seen a handful of times before, but still laughed in all the same places. Incidentally, the reason why I was in Wimborne was because I was at the University of Bournemouth, undertaking a master's in writing for the media, and for my major project, I was embarking upon a biographical drama screenplay based on the life and work of Sir Bill Cotton, the genial head of BBC Light Entertainment, from 1969 to 1977. A few days prior to the show, Barry kindly took part in a telephone interview as part of my research. At the end of the phone conversation, he invited me backstage on the Friday night at the theatre, where I got to meet my hero. Sure enough, he stuck to his promise, and after the show, we met Barry and the lovely Terry in the foyer of the theatre, and I vividly remember him saying to me, "Was the interview okay?" I just remember thinking to myself, "You're Barry Cryer, and you're asking me if that interview was okay." But that really sums Baz up. Humble till the very end, and so generous with his time. Everything he did, he wanted it to be just right, even if that was just a phone interview or a set of jokes. This was the start of a friendship which would last for over a decade. Just a few years later, I had started the podcast and attended a Writers Guild meeting at the Museum of Comedy in Bloomsbury, where the celebrated writing partnership Lawrence Marks and Maurice Gran were the subject of a seminar about situation comedy. Myself and my PA Ben sat ourselves towards the back of the room before the hordes of people entered. All of a sudden, I spotted Barry walking into the theatre, obviously in mid-joke as he made his way to his seat in the front row. It soon became clear that although he was in the audience, Barry wasn't just going to be a passive player in the crowd. Any other entertainer would have probably run the risk of appearing egocentric or arrogant, but there was no denying that Barry was an encyclopedia of comedy, and his contribution enhanced the quality of the discussion. After the session, everyone retired to the bar. 8 years had passed since I last saw him in the flesh, and I figured that he may not remember me. Yet as soon as he caught my eye, he greeted me like an old friend, and I told him about the podcast, and he said, "Well, let's do it." Within a month, I found myself at Barry's house with him recalling anecdotes about some of the most famous people in entertainment history. He absolutely loved it. Without making a sweeping generalization, when encountering people of Barry's age, who arguably lacked the exposure to physical disabilities, they could be excused for appearing patronizing or condescending when attempting to communicate with me. Yet from the day we met, he always treated me as an equal, always directing his communication towards me instead of those around me, something that I always treasured about our times together. He could sense my passion for comedy and realized our mutual investment. Like so many people, I consider myself very lucky to have been the regular recipient of a legendary Barry Cryer phone call, which always gave me so much pleasure. In fact, as a result of my cerebral palsy over the years, Barry and I developed a way of communicating where I would email him with a question, and then he'd ring my PA with his reply. He had an email address which he frequently checked, but very rarely answered, and instead preferred a phone call, presumably because it seemed like he had an audience, even if it was just the one ear. I always cherished these exchanges as he went out of his way to make sure our conversation was the most direct it could possibly be, which always meant a lot. But as comedian Marcus Brigstock explains, I wasn't the only one.
Well, I miss Baz, obviously. I miss his usually twice yearly phone call, once on my birthday and once at any other time where, without saying who it was, he would simply start a joke over the phone. Just start one. A man walks into a pet shop and you'd be like, "Oh, hey, Baz." But he was already in it.
I still have a voicemail on my phone of Baz, which began with him saying, "From one Barry to another." And then he would get into the body of the conversation. A simple joke which always brought a smile, especially when I expected it. Here was a man who had that rare gift of making people of all ages feel comfortable through laughter. A humble guy who was surprisingly self-conscious in interviews, often containing himself with self-deprecating phrases like, "Look, the old man is off again," or "Here he goes." The irony being that Barry was never arrogant or judgmental about his art. He loved all forms of comedy and was a great appreciator and champion of it. If I had one regret about my time with him, it would be not to have asked more about the basic art of laughter, because just like Ken Dodd and Bob Monkhouse, he loved to be analytical in discussing his art and treated it as an art. It was obvious that this was a subject that fascinated him, and I really wish I had asked him more about it over the years. Born in Leeds on the 23rd of March 1935, the northern sense of humour would inform Cryer's early material. The young Barry suffered from a severe form of eczema, which would sadly dominate his early life. Unfortunately, I had little idea of this ailment during our many exchanges, but on reading Barry's son Bob's biography, it encouraged me to understand why he may have had such an affinity with me. Although it's possibly a bit of a stretch to consider eczema a disability, it was still something that made him different from his peers, and I'm sure that the feeling stuck with him throughout his life. Obviously, I'll never know. But maybe this was why he was always comfortable in talking to me, because, in a way, he remembered what it was like being different. Listening to Bob's account of his dad's attitude towards his eczema, this may have been the key to Barry discovering comedy. Realizing his ambition to become a comedian, the magician David Nixon advised Cryer that his future lay outside of Leeds. Undertaking a degree in English at Leeds University where, as Barry used to put it, he failed because of the outbreak of the Second World War, which happened 16 years earlier but upset him very deeply, Barry set his horizons further than Yorkshire, as writer and broadcaster Giles Brandreth explains.
And as I recall, he used to say he'd gone to Leeds University and then gave up because he thought it was easy to be funny than to pass exams. And of course, Leeds, he, I think, first appeared at the Leeds City Varieties Theatre, where the wonderful theatre, where the good old days, I think still the longest running entertainment show on British television, came from for many, many years. And I remember when I first went there to perform myself, Barry said, oh, that's all he said, just growled at me, as though, well, I don't know what he thought. But anyway, I survived. He survived that and thrived.
He took the brave decision to purchase a period return train ticket to London with the intention of making waves in the industry. On the second to last day, he auditioned for Vivian Van Dam at the Windmill Theatre, and as he explained in this interview from 2017, the rest is history.
And I got a bed sit in North Finchley and a 17-day rail return ticket. And I got friends who got me auditions and all sorts, but I thought, it's over. Go home tail between your legs. And the day before the ticket ran out, I got an audition at the Windmill. 10:30 in the morning, wheel them on, wheel them off, conveyor belt. And I auditioned at 10:30, and this voice in the stalls said, know any more jokes? So I told some old jokes. Do you know another song? I said, I haven't got any music. He said, Ronnie will busk for you. This is Ronnie Bridges, a pianist who became a friend. And then thank you. I thought, well, that's it. And then another man who became a friend called John Law comes on the stage. He said, dressing room 12A. I said, sorry, what are you talking about? He said, you've got the job. I was on the stage at 12:30 after auditioning at 10:30. You know, you're in automatic pilot. You're out of it. You don't know what's going on. And the old man, 6 shows a day, 6 days a week, 36 shows. I can't believe it myself looking back. And the old man had me in his office between every show that day, between the fish tank and the desk. Do your act, come on. It was only about 12 minutes, yeah, you know. And he changed it. You tell that joke too soon. That's a good joke. Leave that till the end. He was a brilliant man. And I rang my mother in Leeds and said, I'm a windmill comedian. She had no idea what I was talking about.
Yes, in the space of just 2 hours, Barry had gone from aspiring entertainer to professional comedian, even if his mother didn't know what one of them was. The Windmill would come to be considered the birthplace of post-war British comedy, hosting an unprecedented number of entertainers who would each go on to become legends of their genre. Bruce Forsyth, Tommy Cooper, Harry Seacombe, Spike Milligan, Tony Hancock and Frankie Howerd were just some of the performers who Barry would share the stage with in between the blatant nudity. When discussing this period, Baz would often become extremely passionate and protective about the issue of sexual equality, forever insisting that there were nudes as opposed to basic strippers. To Barry, everyone was an equal, and despite their art being a little antiquated and inappropriate for today's audiences, he still recognized the value in the production, which was devoid of the usual misogyny that was heavily rooted in the art. It was the ultimate schooling, as Barry himself remembered.
What a school that was, because they'd come to see. They weren't strippers, my mates. They were nudes, posing completely still on the stage. It's another world, isn't it? And the customers came to see them. So you learned to die with dignity if you were a comedian. You know, if you got a big laugh, any laugh in the afternoon, you were thrilled. And it brightened up later when they come out the pub, you know. But I'm so grateful I was there. What a school that was. 36 shows a week. Yeah, it's my introduction to London, and Soho was my village. And Soho's bland now. It's quite boring. Smart restaurants and stuff. It was sleazy in those days. It was more fun.
Beyond the controversy surrounding the Windmill, this was where British comedy really came of age, with so many comics learning their craft. In many ways, this crop of comics were unknowingly writing the rulebook for post-war entertainment, and Barry was right there in the centre of it. 6 shows a day, 6 days a week, as Barry put it, walking on and off to the sound of his own feet, it was hard graft. Yet in doing this, performers were creating an entertainment dynasty which would thrive for the next 7 decades. Therefore, Barry had a unique insight into these people who he was able to chart throughout their careers and became an invaluable source for anecdotes. As Lord Grade explains, the Windmill was an important venue for comedians at this time.
Well, it was work, and the big variety theatres wanted names, you know, and it's very hard to get on the bottom rung and get into that circuit. But there was a lot. They did 7-8 shows a day at the Windmill, and they were very good at giving newcomers their start. You know, they didn't pay a lot of money. The attraction wasn't the comedy; it was the girls stripping. That was that's what the Windmill was about. But they needed comedians to fill the space while they were changing the sets and the girls were changing their costumes, and it was good work. And so many big names, big stars: Bruce Forsyth, Tony Hancock, you name it. They all got their first professional work at the Windmill.
Being at the centre of this explosion of talent made him the perfect person to analyse the changing face of comedy. He once told me, "I like talking about the past, but I don't want to live there." But in a way, it was always inevitable because of the significant moments he'd witnessed and the people who he'd worked with. He was a walking, talking encyclopedia of the history of British entertainment, and despite not always being top of the bill, he was still instrumental to so many moments of our comedy heritage. It was while he was at the Windmill that he experienced another eczema flare-up that sadly put a premature end to his performing career. Determined to continue to pursue a career in entertainment, Barry concentrated on the things that he would do, and the art of writing was the perfect fit. Obviously, I can relate greatly to this as a result of my disability, and can imagine how big of a deal this would have been to come to terms with. To realise that you can't do the job that you love must have been a terrible, crushing experience for Baz in what was meant to be an exciting time. For him to persevere with comedy, even when the odds were stacked against him, I think, shows his utter passion and dedication for comedy which surrounded his entire life. The West End in the 1960s was a hotbed of creativity, with revue-style comedy shows dominating the city. The drag sensation Danny LaRue, or as he put it, female impersonator, had built up a reputation as one of the best live acts on the circuit, and from 1957 had set up residency at the nightclub Winston's. At Winston's, LaRue cultivated a repertory company that put on nightly cabaret performances as the last show of the night, sometimes beginning at 1 o'clock in the morning. Danny LaRue was a force of nature, as Michael Grade remembers.
Oh, huge. He was a massive star. In his prime, he could fill the Palace Theatre, the Palladium, Prince of Wales Theatre with a review, a big spectacular review. He was huge. It's very interesting. Every decade, there's a sort of drag artist who becomes a big star. All the way through show business. I could name a few of them. You don't need to know who they are, but Danny was the latest. But he was glamour. He was glamour and funny. And eventually he opened his own club, the Danny LaRue Club in Hanover Square. But he was a lovely man, a sweet man, and a brilliant performer, and very glamorous on stage. But he used to come on with all sequins and a great figure and sequins and a fabulous dress and fans, and they'd make a big entrance. And his opening line was, "Watch your mates."
Featuring a formidable cast who would each go on to become legendary figures in their industry, including Ronnie Corbett, Barbara Windsor, Amanda Barry and Victor Spinetti, Winston's was the setting for a new style of cabaret that brought live comedy to the West End. To do this, Danny LaRue required a resident writer, or writers, to pen the various shows that the cast would deliver. Barry, alongside writers like Ted Dix and Brian Blackburn, became writers for such shows. It was fun times, as Barry recalled.
I met Ronnie Corbett, and I met my darling, who's upstairs at the moment. I met her and him on the very same day. Tossed a coin, married her. A nightclub rehearsal. She'd been in pantomime with Danny LaRue, was a big star in those days. And it wasn't his own nightclub, but he was the star of the show. And he said to Terry, my darling, he said, "What you doing after pantomime?" She said, "Not much." He said, "Do you want to be in my nightclub show?" And that was it. That's how we met. And I'd seen Dan, I think, in a pantomime. Yes, I'd seen him in a pantomime. And we got to know each other. But it was a whole new world for me, and I had to adapt because he was a brilliant drag act. And, you couldn't do it. No filth. You know what I mean? No, he was very prudish, Dan. But you did double entendres and suggestive stuff. And that was another good school. Every few weeks we changed the show, and I had to write a new one. And then Danny would go off and do pantomime, and Ronnie Corbett and I would write a fill-in show while he was away at Christmas. And he'd always say, I might not be back, I'm going to have my own club. And he usually came back. And then one year he said, "I've done it." And he got this club in Hanover Square in London, Danny LaRue's. And we all moved. The dress rehearsal for the new club was the day after the night we'd finished. Saturday night we finished at Winston's. Sunday we were rehearsing a new show at Danny LaRue's club. It's just amazing looking back.
In 1966, Winston's was frequented by a certain David Frost, who was on the lookout for talent for his new revue-type show on the BBC. This was the age of university revue, and Frost had the vision to combine old-school variety with this new kind of comedy, as Barry remembered.
And David Frost had had a drink with me and Ronnie one night in the club, and I became a Frost writer. Been dogged by good luck all my life.
The Frost Report was the first show to combine the tradition of variety theatrical comedy with the cutting-edge material that arose out of the Oxford and Cambridge reviews. It seems amazing that even in the mid-60s, Barry was considered part of the comedy establishment, always welcoming and embracing new talent, as Sir Michael Palin and Miriam Margolyes recall.
But it was going way back to when I first was a very, very junior scriptwriter on David Frost's show called The Frost Report. And I went along very, very fearfully to a meeting of all the writers. And they all sort of seemed to know each other, a lot of the top writers of British comedy. And they all were there, and I sort of came in through the door and looked around a bit. And two people got up and came towards me with their hands out. One was Barry Cryer, and the other was Marty Feldman. And Barry shook my hand and said, "Welcome. You come over to the table, I'll get you to meet people." And no one else had really bothered apart from Marty. And I was very, very pleased about that. I always remained very, very fond of Barry.
He was brilliantly talented. He knew comedy, which is something I don't know. And he was fun and kind.
This generosity of spirit bled through every aspect of his life, which made him the perfect candidate for a collaborative writing project. Throughout his career, Barry partnered with a wide range of writers, from Graham Chapman to John Junkin, to cultivate material for some of the best performers in the business. It was here that he developed a great admiration for the late, great David Frost, and created a friendship that would last for decades, as he explains in this clip from an interview in 2017.
Very affable, marvellous with people. He lit a room up when he came in. He generally liked people, and he could relax his guests when he interviewed them. And John Major said being interviewed by David Frost was like sitting in a warm bath, but wait for the cold shower. Suddenly, in that very friendly voice, he'd ask a deadly question, but before they realised it, they'd answered it. I mean, what TV host helped to bring down an American president? Richard Nixon he interviewed, and he was giving up by the end of the weekend. He was determined to nail Nixon. And he got him on the Sunday night. He said, "Do you think you ought to apologise to the American people?" And Nixon did. And that was it. And Frosty, who'd mortgaged his house and God knows what to make this programme, it sold all over the world. Amazing, bringing down a president. We had a joke about Frosty, by the way. He had an open-top convertible car. And we said if it started raining, David pressed a button on the dashboard, and it stopped raining.
This admiration encouraged Barry to follow David Frost to the newly formed LWT for the sketch show Frost on Sunday, which reunited the comic talents of Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett alongside Josephine Tewson. This was the first time that Corbett and Barker had been seen as a double act, and when Frost was asked to take care of proceedings at the 1970 BAFTA Awards, both of them were on hand to help. Yet a technical difficulty would result in a TV show that would change all their lives, as Barry explained in this clip.
Well, I wasn't there, but I've seen the television. They'd been working. Well, we all went to ITV with David Frost, the two Ronnies before they were known as the two Ronnies, and John Cleese. We all went to ITV with David. And apparently we weren't aware in the background the contract's coming to an end. The timing couldn't have been better. And the two Ronnies were asked to do a turn that night at that event. And Bill Cotton and Paul Fox, BBC eminences, were there and saw the two Ronnies, Corbett and Barker, up there. And they said, they could do their own series. And that's how it happened. They were signed up immediately by the BBC on the strength of that night. Amazing, amazing thing to happen, that. And of course, we all know two Ronnies ran for years.
First broadcast on Saturday the 10th of April 1971, the two Ronnies ruled the Saturday night schedule for over 15 years, with a team of writers who would go on to dominate TV comedy for the next 2 decades. There was just one problem, and that was how they would start each show. Ronnie Barker wasn't a comedian, and so struggled with studio-based comedy. But as this clip shows, Barry had an idea.
Am I given credit for that? I don't remember. I don't know who it was thought of it, but I remember we had a chat with the two Ronnies, and they said, we can't just walk on or come down a staircase. One of us, it may have been me, my memory, said, no, newsreaders sit at desks. Why don't you sit at a desk and do jokes? And then said, yeah, that's the opening of the show. What's the closing? And one of us, maybe me, said the same. Like you said, bookends. The show opened and closed with the two Ronnies sitting at a desk as if they were like newsreaders.
The idea stuck and became the shorthand for the two Ronnies hereafter. It seems a simple concept, but at the risk of slightly deviating from our subject matter, I just want to explain how inspired and clever this idea truly was. It's a common misconception of the public that Ronnie Barker was a comedian, but he definitely wasn't. He couldn't stand being himself on stage because he was essentially a straight actor. Some would describe him as a comic actor, and I would agree to some extent, but he'd done rep and carved out a theatrical career, so was a legitimate actor. He was of the same caliber as people like Judi Dench or Peter Sellers or Leonard Rossiter. They had the potential to be very funny, but they would never do the Glasgow Empire on a Friday night. To me, it's like saying a doctor and a nurse are the same. They're obviously not. Ronnie Corbett, however, had come up through the variety circuit as a stand-up comedian and all-round entertainer. So two men from two totally different backgrounds, one who could interact with audiences and one who, to a certain extent, couldn't. Obviously, the two Ronnies have become one of the best-loved double acts in British TV history, and their silhouette of two spectacles is probably one of the most instantly recognisable images in all of British popular culture. But it wasn't always like this. Ronnie Barker was a reluctant star who hated the spotlight. In fact, for him to be given his own Saturday night light entertainment show would have been like getting Stephen Fry to play left back for England. It just wouldn't happen. For Barry to have had such an inspired idea not only showed his comprehensive understanding of comedy, but also a deep appreciation of human behaviour and the need to cater for individual performances and to play to their strengths. In my opinion, it feels that this is always overlooked when celebrating the careers of the two Ronnies, and it might not have even happened without Barry Cryer. Cryer's comedy palette wasn't just focused on television. In 1972, he was asked to appear on a pilot for a radio panel show presented by the jazz musician Humphrey Lyttelton. A bizarre concept, as Barry recalls.
Well, we can't believe it. We do a stage version of it. And a few weeks ago, as we're talking now, we played at Colston Hall, Bristol, and 3,000 turned up. We couldn't believe what was happening. We're like an old rock band. It's the O2 any minute, you know. And we thought if the audience were our age, they've been dropping off. But we get families and students, and we grew up with you. We're very happy about it. 45 years ago, 1972, and it wasn't regarded as a proposition then. David Hatch's first producer said, oh, put it out on Boxing Day when everybody's pissed. It's not going to work, this. And the bosses at the BBC in those days said, Humphrey Lyttelton on a comedy. He did radio talking about jazz. Humphrey Lyttelton. As it turned out, it was a brilliant idea, and they fought for the show and kept it, and it started working.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry I haven't a clue, never made it to the O2 in Barry's lifetime, but 53 years later, it's still a popular fixture in the Radio 4 schedule, with a whole new generation of comedians making it their own. This was something that forever gave Barry pleasure, knowing that he was passing the metaphorical baton over. In retrospect, Clue remains the closest tangible piece of entertainment to charting the fashions of comedy, and it was all overseen by this passionate, generous oracle of all things laughter, and Miles Jupp, Marcus Brigstock, Giles Brandreth, Michael Grade, and the late great comedy legend Tim Brooke-Taylor perfectly capture this.
But he made it his own. I mean, he was just a fixture on that show. It challenged his sense of humor, how to quickly craft laughs in these ad-lib situations. I don't know how much notice they had of the questions, but it doesn't matter. He could think on his feet. Great ad-libber. And in that team, he was absolutely rock solid. Absolutely rock solid.
Well, Barry was absolutely key to that. Even now, he has this reputation. He was someone that always had his eye on the sort of the current crop, and not in a kind of unpleasant way, as in he really enjoyed all comedy, and he acted as a sort of bridge between those things. He was very supportive and encouraging. When I first ever did a gig with him, it was a charity gig in Edinburgh. He said, already know who I was and was really welcoming and friendly, and you would get these if you were in, sometimes if it was the Saturday repeat or whatever, your phone would ring at about 1 o'clock and it would be Barry and saying, I just listened to that, I really enjoyed it. And it was a really nice thing to hit, because obviously hearing that lovely voice, which you'll have heard so many times, for its distinctive sort of lovely sort of cigarette enhanced tones, he was amazing for being that bridge. And Richard Morris, who's sort of very high up in radio now, saw him giving a speech at a Christmas party a couple of years ago, and he was explaining the old days. You have sort of the old-fashioned lot in their sort of bow ties and one side of the room, and the sort of angry young people on the other side. And then in the middle of it was Barry Cryer, who was able to talk to everybody.
And who I was, and obviously I went on then to record I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue with him, which was always just, one of those moments where you think, well, this is ridiculous that I'm doing this. This just seems mad to be with Graham Garden, Tim Brooke-Taylor, and Barry Cryer. Just extraordinary. He was so richly funny, and I never, I'm sure we all have our moments, but I never heard him say anything negative about comedy, people in comedy, the comedy industry. He seemed to delight in everything new that was happening. And he definitely delighted in everything old that had happened before, because his brain was a repository of just brilliant jokes, which he told so well, and so often. Often, if we're honest, twice in the same night, sometimes even 3 times in the same recording. But I think that was his privilege.
Barry would like to make a Hollywood film of it, but starring himself.
And the great thing about Barry Cryer, it was, A, he was very funny. B, he was incredibly generous. He didn't believe that anybody owned a joke. He thought you had it, like a lease on it for a while, and then you return. When the lease came to an end, you returned it to the public domain, and you passed it on.
From one radio institution to another. In 1978, the once doyen of Radio 1, Kenny Everett, was making the inevitable transition to television, and Thames Television offered him the perfect platform. Together with writer Ray Cameron, father of future light entertainment phenomenon Michael McIntyre, Barry set to work to make the radio star fit for TV, as Michael Grade remembers.
I think it was a marriage made in heaven, because Kenny's personality and brand of humor was completely unstructured, and in the discipline of a half-hour television show, needed some structure and some ground rules and some basics. You need a building block onto which you could put Kenny to just do his mad thing, but you did need, otherwise it would have looked very indulgent and structureless. And Barry brought structure and gave him a foundation upon which to build a lot of madness and insanity and hilarity. That was the crucial thing, and that was a very clever. Whichever producer booked Barry for that show knew what they were doing.
First broadcast on the 3rd of July 1978, The Kenny Everett video show rewrote the rulebook for TV comedy. Yet it did present Barry with a risky problem when negotiating a sketch with the great Billy Connolly, as he told in this interview from 2017.
And Billy Connolly and he became great friends, to the chemistry between those two. And somebody told me there was an underground gents in Leicester Square in those days, and it had an attendant. And there was a man who'd worked there for about 40 years, and he was retiring. So I think a radio interviewer went in to ask him. He said, "You must have seen a lot of changes." He said, "Oh, God," he said, "men coming in together and going into a cubicle, needles and white powder on the floor, and oh dear, it's so different. Anybody comes in here for a straight shit is like a breath of fresh air," he said. And I never forgot that. And I told Everett and Billy Connolly, and we laughed a lot. And I said, "Let's do it." So even Everett said, "We'd never get away with shit on television." So I said, "Take the H out. Anybody comes in here for a straight sit." And we did the sketch on television with Billy Connolly interviewing Everett, or vice versa, I can't remember. But what we didn't tell Billy was strange things were happening behind him. A man came on a unicycle, and one man went into a cubicle and came out in drag, and a juggler came on. And Billy suddenly spotted it on the screen, the monitor in front of him, what was happening behind him, and started laughing. And when Connolly started laughing, the sketch, we had to cut it down. It was 5 minutes, the sketch. It ran about 13 with Bill laughing and chaos. It was a great time.
Pushing the boundaries of comedy was what Barry thrived on. The interesting part here was that Kenny Everett wasn't a comedian or an entertainer. He hadn't come up through the traditional routes of variety or the club circuit. Instead, he was a radio broadcaster in the same way as Noel Edmonds or Tony Blackburn, and I expect there would have been a certain proportion of the comedy fraternity who were turning their noses up at this hairy DJ from Radio 1, trying to muscle his way into the comedy scene. Yet Barry was a maverick himself, who never liked sitting still, always looking for new opportunities and new ideas. When talking about Everett with him, he would become very protective, making the point that Kenny was impossible to categorize, which was correct. This was yet another golden period in a career which boasted so many. However, as Everett's TV dominance began to wane, Barry went back to his roots as a live performer. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Barry became a favourite on the after-dinner circuit. His jokes were always very carefully crafted, with ultimate precision. Unlike performers like Billy Connolly, stand-up didn't always come naturally in the way that it was never just a stream of consciousness. Instead, he cultivated a repertoire of cleverly composed jokes which were the ultimate nod to conventionalism. He was always proud of the fact that he told real jokes and never deviated from them. While the new generation thrived on crafting a narrative with their live act, Barry saw this as a barrier to laughter, and instead stuck to what he was good at, and he was proud of it, and Michael Grade would agree.
Because he was funny. He guaranteed to be funny. And he also could structure, because he was a writer as well as a performer, he knew how to structure a speech with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And he'd have that foundation onto which to weave in the gags and the funny stories and the ad-libs and so on. And many a dinner I went to, he had me in, I knew all the gags, but I was still in stitches,
By the dawn of the new millennium, Barry had reached legendary status, and the succeeding generations were queuing up to collaborate with a definitive hero of British comedy. Whether it was his cleverly crafted ad-libs on I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, the relentless one-man shows he toured nationally alongside pianist Colin Sell, or his insightful contributions to TV documentaries and specials, Cryer was still a major figure in entertainment right up until the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. Indeed, he and his son Bob even created a podcast series called Now Where Were We?, in which they chatted with some of Barry's friends and colleagues about everything from jokes to general life. Listening to these episodes He sounds frail and tired, but there's still the same crier magic there. In many ways, this was the perfect way for him to bow out, doing something he absolutely loved, talking about comedy. And I think this would be the way that I'd want to leave the party too. Who needs the O2 when you have a microphone and a lifetime of great stories? So here, in his own words, and pieced together from the entire series, his dad giving a short rundown of how he went from Barry Cryer, lead schoolboy, to Barry Cryer, beloved comedy institution, which is something he'd never say about himself.
My dad died when I was 5. I had no role model. I hardly knew the man. And Bob Mortimer said his dad died when he was 7. And he said, I realized I wanted to please people when he died. And I have to admit that when my dad went, I hardly knew the man, as I said. I got nobody to show off to. Oh, look at me, Dad. Look what I'm doing, Dad. So I confess, I think I must have decided I wanted to show off. But no, I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to write. But I was a failure at university. BA English failed. And they made me honorary Doctor of Arts.
Which university was this?
Leeds.
You got into Leeds University?
Yes.
But you didn't stay
And then
the
they
course.
kicked me out, yes. Because I was chasing girls and always in the bar, I confess.
You did
And-
also get a professional gig, didn't you? After that.
Well, a man came up to Leeds to see somebody and saw me in the student show, charity show, the Rag Review, and offered me work. I couldn't believe what was happening. And then I made my professional debut in the City Varieties Theatre in my hometown, and television was now on the march, and the music halls and variety theatres were suffering. So they introduced strippers, so they lost the family audience.
You both met your wives whilst working.
Yes.
My mum,
Yeah.
a singer, dancer at Danny LaRue's club.
Best thing that ever happened to me was meeting her. I was standing next to the piano. I met my wife the very same day I met Ronnie Corbett. Tossed a coin and married. And of course, that was after writing the nightclub shows for Danny LaRue. David Frost saw a little thing I'd written in a review at the Fortune Theatre for Anna Quayle, the actress, and said, who wrote that? And one thing led to another. David Frost came to Danny LaRue's club and everything, and you become one of the Frost gang. And of course, all doors were open then. You could have been a rubbish writer. Well, he wouldn't have taken you on board, I suppose. But if you were known as a David Frost writer, everybody wanted to know. Ronnie said to me one day, he said, I don't know what rung of the ladder you're on, Baz, but stay there. He said, you're always around, but nobody's pointing at you. I'm the peripheral figure, the straight man, the co-writer, the all over the place, the warm-up man.
Yeah, but also, do you know, I have to say, probably one of the warmest, actually, that I've met.
Oh.
And it's true. And do you know what it is? It's no need to thank me, it's the truth. And because I think that, particularly with comedians, there are those comedians, one assumes that all comedians want to make people laugh, but there are those who also want to be made to laugh.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, and that suddenly divides that very large group into a much smaller one. But in terms of the warmth and encouragement, I don't know anyone else who's been as consistent across the board.
That is one of the greatest privileges of when I tell people who my dad is, they recognize the surname. The first thing they do is smile, because you have a very positive effect on.
I love people laughing, and it doesn't have to be me who makes them laugh. Graham Garden, my old friend, said, oh, Baz needs an audience. And I'd say, I prefer Baz needs people.
Yeah, it's like a social.
I'm determinedly gregarious.
The last time I heard from Barry was the day before my show at the Museum of Comedy, alongside the great Arthur Smith. He rang me to wish me good luck and made his apologies for not being able to attend. Yet he did have one piece of advice for me. He said, you need one good gag to get them going, then let them do the rest. Whenever I do any sort of live show, I always think about this, and despite not always being on stage, it still influences how I approach the show. Such simple advice, but coming from one of the greats, it meant a lot. On the 25th of January 2022, I was ironically in Newcastle visiting a sick aunt when I heard the tragic news of Barry's passing. End of an era is a cliché term, particularly amongst entertainment professionals, but it really did feel like something had ended. That direct link to the pioneering generation of entertainment had gone. I instantly checked my phone and realized that I had been inundated with messages wanting my reaction. I'm sure that there were bigger news stories dominating the headlines on that day, but for the comedy industry, this was a dark day. Yet, on grieving his loss, it was time to look back and examine his legacy as Giles Brandreth, Miriam Margolyes, Michael Palin, Dirk Maggs, and Michael Grade reflect on.
You will have, I know, on this show, this podcast you're creating, lots of people telling his favourite stories involving parrots, mostly. I do remember during COVID, he telephoned most days with a new joke. My favourite one, I think, was the airline pilot, Mid-Atlantic, speaking to the people flying in the aeroplane. And the payoff was really hoping they had a safe flight. If there's any turbulence, stay where you are, and be sure the seatbelt's on, with the lights are on above. And basically, ending up his message, the pilot saying, "I do hope you have a good holiday in Jamaica, wherever you're going, and I wish you well." And of course, today it's Wednesday, so I'm working from home, but do enjoy the rest of the flight. Anyway, it made me chuckle. The only joke of mine that I think made him chuckle was one he claimed he never heard before. And it's this. What does the king do when he burps? What does the king do when he burps? He issues a royal pardon. And Barry said to me, "I don't think I've ever heard that joke before." He said, "and I hope never to hear it again."
Barry was one of the most rewarding friendships of my life, my friendship with Barry. It wasn't only that he made me laugh whenever he rang up with another joke. It never ended the phone call without me laughing at some point.
Meeting him in '96 as judge at the BBC New Comedy Awards was just incredible. And he seemed from then, actually, he had that sort of glint in his eye behind those big glasses. He seemed, I tell you what he did, he seemed to be a friend straight away, rather than, well, I'm a big man in comedy who's done this for years. He just carried himself like a friend from the beginning. So, Baz, I love you, pal.
I could have listened to Barry forever, and maybe, when my time comes, I'll go up there and see Barry up in the great beyond.
The last time I worked with Barry was on a dramatisation of Spike Milligan's novel Puckoon by Ian Billings, which Radio 4 had bought as their sort of Christmas offering. And we needed a narrator. I felt it would be perfect if we could have someone who knew Spike and understood the humour. And the obvious person was Barry, and bless him. Barry came in, and although he was walking with a stick by now and getting frailer, it was still Barry, still with that energy and that power and that sense of humour, still stopping the read-through to tell another joke. And he headed up a cast including Ed Byrne, Pauline McClin, Wolf Scolding, Jane Milligan, Spike's daughter. And it was just a terrific opportunity to have Barry Cryer reading Spike Milligan's words in between parrot jokes. I will always miss him. I miss the phone ringing and, "Dirk, don't want to bother you, but I just have to tell you this one." But it never was a bother, because it was Barry, and it was always a joy, and there would always be something funny, and there would be that reassuring presence that someone understood what you were trying to create and how hard it could be, and had your back, basically. And for that reason, we will all miss him.
We're lucky these days we have recordings, and his legacy is there on YouTube. Any great comedian, great British comedians, you go on YouTube and there's Barry's work. That's the legacy. It's just brilliant. That's brilliant. And also, I always thought one of his greatest legacies is can be quite a bitchy business, show business. I don't think he had an enemy in the world, Barry. Very rare you could say that about anybody. I'm sure I've got enemies, but everybody adored Barry. You're always pleased to see him. Always, always, always. Lovely man. Rest in peace. Wonderful man.
When creating this episode, I was determined to make it chronologically relevant to celebrate all aspects of Barry's career. Yet the irony is, here was a man who was devoid of convention and wasn't concerned about paths or studying trends. He loved to analyse comedy only for the sake of laughter, and very rarely for political purposes. He didn't care much for battling against changing tides and instead embraced new ideas, times, and more importantly, stars. Yet, above all, I shall forever remain proud to have been able to call him a friend. It's clear that Baz might have gone, but from the tributes paid to him in this episode, and the lifetime of laughter which he created, he shall never be forgotten. As for the last word, well, it's only right that we leave this to the man himself.
Oh, I don't care. I don't care. People remember what I think. It's irrelevant, I think. I don't mean to root your question, but I'm not bothered. I just think people make their own minds up.